Hi, everyone who is here tonight and those joining us on YouTube Live or the McConnell Center podcast. My name is Sydney Finley, a senior scholar from Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm honored to be giving the introduction for our guest speaker for tonight's event, Ms. Grace Olmstead. Grace is a journalist and author of Uprooted, Recovering the Legacy of the Places We've Left Behind. A graduate of Patrick Henry College with a degree in journalism, her writing has been published in the American Conservative, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, among others. Grace's work focuses on the intersections of family, localism, and agriculture, and how these intersections impact our perceptions and outlooks on life. She has been influenced not only by her own experiences growing up in rural Idaho, but also by notable writers such as Kentucky's own Wendell Berry. With her book Uprooted, Grace has proven to be a notable writer on the American experience in rural life. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce her to you all this evening. Please join me in welcoming Mrs. Grace Olmstead.
Thank you so much. It's a very humbling introduction, and it's a delight to be with you all. I'm so excited to get to talk to you and have enjoyed the conversations I've gotten to have with you all up to this point as well. In 1967, Joan Didion declared that the center was not holding. She had spent several months with the young adults of San Francisco's hippie counterculture movement, located in the city's Haight-Ashbury district. Her resulting essay, Slouching Toward Bethlehem, told a haunting story. The counterculture movement these young people represented had promised hope and renewal. American young people had identified real flaws in U.S. culture and politics, but these young people were struggling to build a full, flourishing alternative. They were lost and alone. Many of them were runaways, vulnerable to drug addiction. Didion's missing center suggested that a sense of wholeness, purpose, and telos ought to exist at the core of American socio-political existence. What aim guides our exploring, our political involvement, our familial and communal lives? Alas, Didion could not find a center. Neither could the young people she befriended. Instead of a center, Didion identified fracture and fragmentation. There was no way to hold or to be held. 1 year later, in 1968, Kentucky poet, essayist, and farmer Wendell Berry wrote his essay, A Native Hill. The essay described Berry's homecoming, the culmination of an intellectual journey that had led him from Kentucky to Stanford, Stanford to Italy, Italy to New York City, and then finally back to Kentucky. In defiance of his professorial mentors and most popular wisdom, Berry left behind a prestigious academic job in New York City and returned to the county of his birth. He moved home. Berry represented then, and to a large extent represents now, a different kind of counterculture. The young people that Didion met grew up, in her words, cut loose from the web of cousins and great aunts and family doctors and lifelong neighbors who had traditionally suggested and enforced society's values. Didion associated a lack of guiding, nourishing center with the dissolution of familial and associational ties in American life. In this sense, her essay mirrors the thought of sociologists Robert Nisbet and Robert Putnam, respectively, in their books The Quest for Community and Bowling Alone. But Berry, due to his rural upbringing, represented a slightly different generational experience. He was not much older than the young people Didion met in San Francisco, but he had been shaped by a set of relational ties that refused to leave him as he traveled to faraway places. Of his small Kentucky hometown, Berry wrote, quote, "All that any of my family may know of ourselves is to be known in relation to this place. And since I did most of my growing up here and have had most of my most meaningful experiences here, the place and the history for me have been inseparable. And there is a sense in which my own life is inseparable from the history and the place. It is a complex inheritance, and I have been both enriched and bewildered by it." Berry's consideration of place as a complex inheritance here hints at the ideas I want to unpack with you today. I want to suggest that Berry's localism presents a center that is compelling precisely because it is diffuse. He offers a vision in which our socio-political life might grow from the virtues of humility, prudence, and love. But in order to understand this diffuse center and the way it pushes us beyond our normal dichotomies of left and right, we have to first consider the anthropology it supports. Before we get into the readings that many of you have so graciously considered this week, we must ask the most basic of questions. What does it mean to be human? Our answer to this question helps to explain which socio-political visions we find nourishing and hopeful. It explains the utopias we desire and the dystopias we fear. Without some understanding of who we are and who we ought to become, we will struggle to articulate a proper vision of our political and cultural life. The European Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries articulated an anthropology that has deeply influenced our socio-political life in the centuries since. Enlightenment thinkers like René Descartes suggested that we are, as theologian James K. Smith has put it, heads on a stick. They suggested that we are thinking things rather than embodied beings, defined first and foremost by our intellectual life and our reason. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. This dualist philosophy emphasizes our autonomy and individualism, our capacity to shape our environments to our will. As Dr. Norman Wiersbe puts it in his book, Agrarian Spirit, when life is characterized as a power internal to things, then it is apparent that the relationships that join living beings to each other, though important, are not constitutive. They are not primary. What a living thing is can be thought apart from the connections it finds itself in. If relationships are entered into, it is on a voluntary basis. The political vision that emanates from this dualistic and internalized vision of human nature is that of, for instance, the autonomous taxpayer, whose telos is wrapped up in national political parties. All political allegiances are chosen, curated, and easily dispensed with. Political relationships sprout not through immediate local cares, but through shared ideological talking points. Coalitions find their voice and community through cable news, talk show radio, or on Instagram, and they gather not in homes or town halls, but on Twitter or on the Mall in Washington, D.C. There is a different view of human beings and our flourishing that we ought to consider here. It's a view that opposes those aforementioned Enlightenment philosophies. It is an ancient, multi-ethnic, and multicultural understanding of what it means to be human. And it is present in the writing of bell hooks, Wendell Berry, Robin Wall Kimmerer, and countless other important thinkers. It suggests, along with Aristotle, that you are by nature a social animal. Society is something that precedes the individual. We are not heads on a stick. We are embodied and embedded beings, defined first and foremost by our relational life and our loves. This understanding of humanity is undergirded by what Norman Wiersbe and anthropologist Tim Ingold call meshwork thinking. Quote, "Things have no existence and no life apart from their participation in the movements of fellow creatures happening all around and within. Minds and lives are not closed-in entities that can be enumerated and added up. They are open-ended processes whose most outstanding characteristic is that they carry on. And in carrying on, they wrap around one another like many strands of a rope. The rope is always weaving, always in process, and, like social life itself, never finished. Another way to put this is to say that for an organism to be is not only to become in a place, but also to become in and through relationships. This means that people do not simply enter into and exit from relationships in the course of their living. The relating goes deeper than that. For me to exist as the being that I am, I must have always been in relationships with microorganisms, a mother's womb, a life-supporting ecosystem, and myriads of processes that are not optional or always chosen. If this is true, then a living organism is more like a verb than a noun, because life depends on the constant intermingling with others. To understand a life, one must understand, at least to some degree, the stories of the multiple lives, large and small, and the multiple places, near and far, that have fed into and supported that life, end quote. This anthropological vision emphasizes our relationality and our dependence. It suggests that we are porous beings, inextricably woven into a webwork or a meshwork that both transcends and surrounds us. It's the understanding of human life that undergirds the architecture of Pompeii, as Chuck Marohn points out in his article, The Spooky Wisdom of Cities, with its shared walls, shared streets, and public forum. Marohn describes Pompeii as one component of an evolving human ecosystem. Its habitat helped the people of Pompeii meet their daily needs, but it also helped them raise their young, care for their elderly, save for the future, pass along their stories and culture, and reach for higher truths by communing with the existential. In short, the city helped make them human. This anthropological vision contrasts strongly with that of the detached, self-interested, quote, head on a stick. The embedded and embodied, those are hard to say right in a row, politics it promotes is the politics of the relational member whose existence is enveloped within proximate relationships, relationships that radiate outward from the neighborhood and the polis. Politics become dependent, relational, and porous. While it still welcomes deeply held philosophical and theological understandings, this political vision is also pragmatic and particular. It is concerned first with the trash on this particular sidewalk and the housing needs of this particular community. It encourages human beings to demonstrate activism through tangible and proximate forms of neighborliness and care. A politics built according to meshwork thinking will necessarily be place-focused. It must also be animated by two key virtues, prudence and love. I will talk about prudence and love in a moment, but first, why does a meshwork politics need to be place-focused? As Ted McAllister notes in his chapter on Making American Places in the book Why Place Matters, we moderns are liberated from the unchosen restraints of our ancestors, for we have largely mastered space with transportation and communication technologies. The impulse toward liberation from space, from place specifically, and toward a resultant celebration of boundaryless space is strong throughout US history. But all spaces, I would like to point out, are places to someone or something, home to a web of plant, animal, and human life that predates us. To acknowledge the placedness of the desert, the plains, the ocean, or the city, is to acknowledge the fact that each and every one of these ecosystems is a home. Ignorance of places and their histories is not freeing. For many communities in the United States, such a dehistoricizing instinct represents a violent and oppressive past, one that violently severed indigenous communities from their homes, as Barry talks about in his essay, A Native Hill. We do not live in empty or timeless spheres of potentiality. We each live in a specific corner of the world with a specific set of histories and struggles and a specific set of environmental, political, and cultural dynamics. Our political life should therefore be, quote, rooted in deep attachment to particular and flawed people rather than devotion to abstract principles, as McAllister writes. Our community's ongoing well-being is inextricably bound up in our, quote, willingness or perhaps even eagerness to act with others toward shared purposes, to compromise, to converse, and to understand one's unique life as entangled in a skein of relationships that help constitute one's personhood. This place-focused vision of politics seeks to work out certain principles of Catholic social teaching, most clearly the principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is generally defined as the belief that social and political issues should be dealt with at the most immediate level, the smallest, lowest, or least centralized level that is consistent with their resolution. Some battles and some solutions must necessarily focus on a larger scale. That larger scale is, in fact, their proper scale. But even in such instances, we apply and practice the lessons these battles teach us at home, in our own communities, on our own streets, with our own neighbors. A place-focused politics calls us to responsibility and to stewardship, to live out what we believe step by step, home by home. The pragmatic and locally focused concept of subsidiarity leads us therefore to consider the virtue of prudence and why it matters to our discussion of place. Prudence, phronesis to the Greeks, speaks to the practical and immediate application of universal principles. In his book, After Virtue, Alasdair MacIntyre suggests that the exercise of the virtues requires a capacity to judge and to do the right thing in the right place, at the right time, in the right way. No easy task. This is the work, however, of prudence. It is the intellectual virtue that enables us to demonstrate virtues in all other modes of life. Without prudence, we may fail in our efforts to act justly, to do rightly, and to walk humbly. There is therefore a particularizing instinct in prudence that enables us to live rightly within specific meshworks, one that emphasizes and further reinforces the belief that we live not separate from community, but as embodied and embedded beings with particular responsibilities in particular places. After all, no one place is the same. You cannot care for your neighborhood in New York City in exactly the same way that you might love your town of 3,000 people in Idaho. But in loving each according to its needs, acknowledging its history, its virtues, and its injustices, you allow for the sorts of political diversity, cultural nuance, and difference that must be included in any consideration of the United States as a place. You cannot expect Louisville, Kentucky, and Portland, Maine to have the same strengths and weaknesses or to respond identically to the same sets of policies. To care for either community will require prudence, and this prudence requires works of attention to both past and present that will inform our understanding and decision-making. In his essay, The Work of Local Culture, Barry instructs his readers in prudence by describing a series of visions. He describes a bucket, gathering and making soil. He looks at the gullies and scars created by logging, mining, and farming. And he points to the trash and junk that litter roadsides. In order to understand the needs of our communities, we have to first see what is flourishing and see what is breaking. We have to look around us just as Barry does. In that moment of imminent encounter, we should feel a sense of responsibility that calls us to act, to exercise prudence. In the presence of a single place, the manifold ties between the individual and the community become sharper and clearer. You cannot walk through a grocery store without feeling the responsibility to stop, talk, and ask how people are, at least if you're in a small town grocery store. You cannot easily ignore the meal train signups when a friend or family member has a need. You are more vulnerable, more aware, more indebted to the world around you. That trash on the sidewalk becomes yours to clean up. The weeds in the playground are yours to remove. The spatial dimensions of your life fill with meaning and obligation, layers and layers of it, day after day. That is what membership, what meshwork living, means. You become a steward, whether you meant to become one or not. When I lived in other places, I looked on their evils with the curious eye of a traveler, Barry writes. I was not responsible for them. It cost me nothing to be a critic, for I had not been there long, and I did not feel that I would stay. But here, now that I am both native and citizen, there is no immunity to what is wrong. Of course, the whole idea of being immune from the demands and needs of a place is completely false. It is to create a constructed space, and in that process, to ignore our environment's lived realities, to try and create a buffer between us and the world around us. In many ways, this is what social media and technology can tempt us to do. As Christine Rosen writes in her essay, The New Meaning of Mobility, one consequence of new technologies is, quote, the homogenization of experience, an attempted departicularization of our attention and of our sense of space and time. She writes, we take our devices with us wherever we go, staying connected to our social networks and tapping into the same sources of news and entertainment that we would access at home. The 24/7 hum of electronic communication is having a similar effect, making our experience of every place like every other. end quote. But ironically, our increased connectivity has not improved our sense of togetherness or our sense of community. Quite the opposite. Recent polls of young people report astonishingly high rates of depression, anxiety, and loneliness. As Jean Twenge revealed in her book iGen, increased rates of loneliness and anxiety among US teenagers directly correlate with the advent of smartphones and increased use of social media platforms. The hope that social media might somehow replace local culture or local relationships is a false one. As Rosen puts it, quote, "A genuine awareness of location or place leads us to recognize that much of the ritual and happenstance of everyday life, from the family meal to a passing conversation with a stranger on the bus, is necessarily tied to place." The work of prudence requires attention to the present moment, but it also asks us to build a knowledge of local history that runs deep. When a community loses its memory, Berry writes, its members no longer know one another. How can they know one another if they have forgotten or have never learned each other's stories? Bell Hooks points to the importance of this attentiveness and historic understanding in her essay, Kentucky is My Fate. As she considers her childhood in Kentucky, her move to Stanford University, and her eventual return home, she emphasizes a widespread refusal to reckon with the state's racist history. Quote, "Growing up in that world of Kentucky culture where the racist aspect of the Confederate past was glorified, a world that for the most part attempted to obscure and erase the history of Black Kentuckians, I could not find a place for myself in this heritage. For decades, this past and present seemed to offer no hope for the future. Hooks practiced the virtues and traditions of her community in other places. But in her essay, she also celebrates the beautiful life lessons her forebears taught her and the vibrant subcultures Black folks had created and continued to create in Kentucky, ultimately with a clear-eyed understanding of both the injustices and the beauties of her homeland. Hook returns home. She says, "My decision to return home did not emerge from any sentimental assumption that I would find an uncorrupted world in my native place. Rather, I knew I would find there living remnants of all that was wonderful in the world of my growing up." Also leaving New York City, also returning to Kentucky, Wendell Berry writes in A Native Hill of a love for his homeland that he can't shake. But just like Hooks, there are aspects of Kentucky's past and present that Berry does not love, that he has to confront. Quote, "I am forever being crept up on and newly startled by the realization that my people established themselves here by killing or driving out the original possessors, by the awareness that people were once bought and sold here by my people, by the sense of the violence they have done to their own kind and to each other and to the earth, by the evidence of their persistent failure to serve either the place or their own community in it. I am forced against all my hopes and inclinations to regard the history of my people here as the progress of the doom of what I value most in the world, the life and health of the earth, the peacefulness of human communities and households," end quote. I want to emphasize the fact that what Berry and Hooks write here, constitutes true love of place. It is complex and messy. It contains both delight and indignation. It sees the brokenness and the injustice as well as the beautiful. When I was younger, my understanding of loving place was influenced by surrounding consumerist culture. I thought I could pick and choose the place that perhaps felt right, that looked beautiful, that ticked every box on my list of appealing places in which to live. I think this is a very understandable impulse, but it can also be a dangerous one. It can nurture an extractive mentality in which we are more focused on what places give us rather than on the ways in which we might serve our communities, care for local ecology, or impact social and political change. There's also a danger that we might feel simply nostalgic in loving a place. In my book, Uprooted, I argue that nostalgia can prompt us to view complicated, messy places with a false simplicity or sentimentality. It can convince us to return to a place that no longer exists, or one that perhaps never existed in the first place. Nostalgia can be reactionary or bitter and can urge us to resist forms of change in place that are healthy, that indicate growth. It can also urge us to excuse or overlook injustice or unhealthy practices in the places we love, as we avoid hard and necessary reforms in our desire to celebrate what we value. So both consumerist love of place, which is primarily self-focused, and nostalgic love of place, which tends toward an idolization of past, place, or both, are dangerous. What is the alternative? As Barry's essay on local culture suggests, love for place should grow in and through the hard work of paying attention, learning more about the places we care about, and grappling with the difficult problems that they face. True love grows through the day-by-day work of exercising prudence and understanding particularity. When we love a person for a long time, we often find we love them despite or even through the ways in which they annoy us, disappoint us, and need us. I think places are quite similar. They demand a lot of us. They can disappoint us. We should be sorrowful over their injustices and hurts, and we should be thinking actively about their needs. But the process of attending carefully to these places is a necessary part of growing and deepening a love that isn't saccharine or temporary, but long-lasting and deep. I suggest at the end of Uprooted that anything else is not really love, but rather idolization. One example, perhaps, of thinking through the demands of loving attention might be considering my own home state, Idaho's rapid suburbanization, and how to respond to or to think through that change. I argue in my book that it's important to emphasize the fact that growth is good. Places do not stay the same. They shouldn't be static. A growing, diversifying community is something to celebrate. But how we grow, how we build houses and zone our communities, for instance, is something that can be done in a historically and environmentally thoughtful way, in a way that seeks to preserve farmland, grassland, and native plants, that seeks to make sure there are plenty of affordable housing options for both newcomers and existing citizens, and that is cognizant of the impact of development on local businesses and commerce. In terms of farm policy, I tried to think through the long-lasting impact of policies that encourage concentration in a very brittle model of farm development, and what it means to love and appreciate the work that many farmers are doing while also seeking to advocate for important reforms. Through the process of writing my book, I realized how much I had changed because of the research I had done. I was not the same person who had started writing. My vision had been complicated. My understanding of Idaho, of home, farming, community, and more had all been altered by the long hours of researching and interviewing. I emerged with a far more complicated understanding of place. My love emerged intact, but changed and in many ways new as a result of that work. It's not nostalgic or consumerist. It isn't perfect by any means, but I would say it feels more like loving a person does, like a complicated, messy relationship with something that is truly beautiful, wonderful, and deserving of ongoing care and investment. There are a lot of voices in our world that suggest that success means going far and leaving home behind. My hope is that we can make it easier for people to remain in their communities for the long haul, because that dedication and that sense of membership, whether to a place you've always called home or to a new place that you make home, that is vital to meshwork living. It's vital that when and where we can, we might choose to embrace our places and the call to reciprocity that they demand. One of the beauties of the habits that this sort of living creates is that it replaces extractive modes of living and relationship with habits of generosity and care. It nourishes and builds strength rather than sapping it away. To quote Robin Wall Kimmerer's beautiful essay, The Gift of Strawberries, gifts from the earth or from each other establish a particular relationship, an obligation of sorts to give, to receive, and to reciprocate. In the gift economy, gifts are not free. The essence of the gift is that it creates a set of relationships. The currency of a gift economy is, at its root, reciprocity. In my family's tiny Virginia town, where we lived for 4 years, I saw folks on the left and the right band together to help get sidewalks built in order to increase the town's walkability and safety. Neighbors worked together to plant trees to host community events, and to care for each other in the midst of COVID. I actually bartered a loaf of sourdough bread at one point for some venison. And I remember early in the COVID season, our mayor and vice mayor, both politically progressive, asked a local friend, a Catholic mom, to sew face masks for families in the town because masks were scarce. On our doorstep, on the morning of Easter 2020, we received a care package that included a bottle of local wine, hand sanitizer, also a precious commodity, and 4 perfectly sewn face masks, sized according to the age of each member of our family. These are little things, but they demonstrate the power of a place-focused politics. They illustrate the power of a politics that is predicated on place and relationship. Locally focused politics does not immediately answer all the necessary questions, nor does it offer a one-size-fits-all solution. But it does suggest that we can start at home and begin building the relationships, the forms of care, and the responsible, integrity-filled systems that might inspire action on a larger scale. This is a process of culture building, of fighting loneliness and isolation that many of our communities desperately need. It is hopefully humble enough to encourage and support people regardless of their politics, because it is about seeing and serving real people in real time. The center was not holding. Young people in the 1960s, much like young people now, felt a lack of purpose and a sense of disillusionment in the world at large. But in the year 1968, Wendell Berry suggested the possibility of a new center. It was not a glamorous center, nor was it a one-size-fits-all center, but that is perhaps where its power lies. Thank you.